It's the week ending Friday the 25th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Vatican announcing the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88, the US Secretary of State dropping out last minute from Ukraine peace talks in London, and West End producers confirming that Paddington the Musical will open in November. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Irene Forshaw and Harriet Marsden. And we welcome back freelance journalist Sachandrika Chakrabarti. What have you all been up to whilst I've been sunning myself for 3 weeks? How was your Easter?
Nothing as glamorous as that. Well, I went to a wine tasting just outside.
That's pretty glamorous.
Pretty glamorous, yeah. I went to a wine tasting just outside Brighton. And what else to do? And then I went for Nando's. So that was a perennial glamour.
A perfect pairing. Sachandrika, how was your Easter?
I saw a giant bunny rabbit walking his dog down my local high street. He was just waving at people. It was a person dressed as a bunny rabbit. Spoiler alert.
Well, I presume a rabbit on a way to an egg hunt and had pets to walk.
Yes, I felt like the true meaning of Easter was revealed to me in that moment. So, yeah, still reeling.
Yeah. Did you do an egg hunt? Have you ever done an egg hunt?
I have done in the past when I was a child. I didn't. Now I'm an adult. So.
No, well, look, as an adult, every day's an egg hunt. Am I wrong? I have chocolate whenever I want. Harriet, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
An unholy legacy.
As I said, we lost our father. Also a bit of our father, the father of the Argentinians, whom we didn't always understand, but deeply loved.
The current Archbishop of Buenos Aires giving a eulogy for the Pope on Tuesday. Harriet, obviously the Pope's passing is the big story of the week, but perhaps we haven't been briefed on how he's viewed in his homeland.
So that's what I think is the under the radar aspect of this story, is not so much the death of the Pope, but the death of the first Latin American Pope, the death of a Pope who was Argentinian, but who never returned to Argentina after becoming Pope, despite returning to almost all the neighbouring countries of Argentina. So today we're going to be talking about why that is, why his legacy is so divisive in his native home country, and why that has not necessarily been reflected in coverage around the world.
Love it. Okay, so Jorge Mario Bergoglio wasn't he, before he was Pope Francis? What was Bergoglio's legacy in Argentina?
Bergoglio? You were close. Yeah, so he grew up in Buenos Aires. He grew up in a working class, very, very poor neighborhood and worked as a priest there in a poor neighborhood of Buenos Aires. And then when he became the Archbishop of the capital of Argentina, he built up churches there. So there has been this enormous emotional reaction to his death in those poor neighborhoods neglected by successive governments. But his approval rating had absolutely plummeted in the time since he became Pope, when it was a huge celebration in Argentina and people were delighted about it, to the end of his life, where his approval rating had plummeted from 91% down to 64%, although had stayed pretty high in other Latin American countries around Argentina. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of this story, is why he was so divisive in Argentina and why he never returned.
Okay, all right. So that's kind of in more recent times why he continued to be divisive. But what did they think of Bergoglio at the point that he became Pope? They were celebrating the fact that a Latin American had become Pope, were they? But he had a mixed legacy anyway.
He did already have a mixed legacy as the Archbishop. He had been seen as a Peronist, which is the big political divide in Argentina, has been for a very long time, to do with the legacy of Juan Domingo Perón, who was the populist nationalist leader of the 1940s. So Peronism is kind of like a left-leaning populism that kind of rejects capitalism and advocates for the poor. And the Pope was seen very much as a Peronist, although he always denied that he was affiliated with it. But as Archbishop, he was seen as a Peronist, but a very socially conservative one. So a sort of right-leaning Peronist, socially conservative on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion. And so that basically put him at odds with every political leader that Argentina has had for the last 20 years. That's basically been all Peronists, but like left-leaning, like a little bit more socially progressive. And as Archbishop, he clashed loads with Nestor Kirchner, which was the president from 2003 to 2007. And then his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who was president after him, and then vice president again later on. So basically 20 years worth of clashes. About halfway through that time, the Pope became the Pope. He went from Archbishop to Pope. And I think, broadly speaking, people assumed that as Pope, he would become more politically neutral in Argentina. Like, that was sort of the understanding that now he was Pope, he was going to be less interfering in politics, less clashing, less seen as the spiritual leader of the opposition, which is what he was known as by the then president. But that was broadly not the case. So basically, he managed to really annoy a lot of left-leaning liberals by being very socially conservative and very anti a lot of left-leaning progressive policies, but also annoy a lot of conservatives and right-wingers because they hate Peronism.
By being progressive for a Pope.
By being Peronist, because they see it as chaotic and economically disastrous. And then later, when he became known as a relatively liberal Pope, then also bugged a lot of the conservatives as well. So basically a super, super divisive figure, in the sense that also anyone involved in politics in Argentina becomes a very divisive figure.
Okay, so Chandrika, what was his relationship like with the current president then, Javier Milei?
There are two pictures of the Pope, of the recently late Pope, that I enjoy seeing, and one of them is him on the subway in Argentina in 2008, and so it's after that he has sort of that issue with Argentina and never goes back, and it seems to be at a political level, and it's the people in Argentina who seem to remember him as being good to the poor. The other picture is of Milei embracing him, hugging him like his long-lost grandfather, just looking utterly thrilled. And this picture was taken after Milei called Pope Francis the representation of evil on earth. So it's been a real game of two halves, that relationship.
And that was when he was Pope, he called him that?
Yes. He wasn't a fan. It's because of the left-wing politics that Pope Francis is associated with. He's seen to be on the left, Milei very much on a populist kind of stance that he got into power. And it kind of really U-turned and became a very loving embrace. There were pastries, there was a tea going on, and he embraced him and really decided that he'd changed his mind. He said that the Pope had started to build a positive relationship with him, and he realised the Pontiff was the most important Argentine in all of Argentina, the leader of the world's Catholics. As a result, I had to reconsider some positions in Milei, which I think is an incredible understatement when you put the photo next to it. I implore everyone to go and Google this photo. It's incredible. I
mean, Irene, the approval ratings that Harriet was discussing, why do you think they dropped so significantly during the Pope's period in office, if you can call it that, versus the movement that Chandrika is talking about at the high levels of politics where people embraced him?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. He was quite popular to begin with, and he saw his his favourability among people in Argentina plunge by almost 30 percentage points. And I think one of the things that people found the most difficult is they were so excited, but then he never came back, and it felt like quite a snub. So, he went to visit several of the neighbouring countries. He visited Brazil, he visited Chile, he visited Paraguay, and he kept sort of vaguely mentioning that he would be back. And he just never came back. And I think it's picking up on what Harriet said. He became quite a polarising figure. Argentina has such a divided political landscape, and people saw him as interfering in politics. He was criticised on both sides.
And the conversation then, Harriet, in Argentina now must be very different to how it's being reported everywhere else.
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point of this, and that's what I think is so interesting about so many of these stories about him, is that the way that he has been portrayed in English-speaking, largely US and UK media, is very different to the perception of him in Argentina, which the perception of him is still very much associated with the military dictatorship of the 1970s. So this is going back a long way. This is a long time before he was even archbishop, was when he was leading the Jesuits in Argentina. And during that time, 2 priests were very famously abducted and tortured. There's no evidence that Bergoglio did anything wrong. There's no evidence that he collaborated with the military junta. But there is a widespread perception that he didn't do enough to save lives. He didn't do enough to oppose the dictatorship. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, as Irene was saying, very divided political landscape. So pretty much everyone is going to have a problem with him in some way, but also known very much to have resisted the push to legalize abortion in Argentina and the push to kind of legalize or start the process of legalizing same-sex marriage. Like, he is seen in UK and US-centric media as a relatively liberal pope on these issues.
Yeah, it's a progressive force, I'd say. Like, maybe even the most prominent progressive politician in the world, you know, is how he's portrayed.
It's actually so interesting because it's not at all true.
I think just to come in, I think it's quite interesting how much his positions have changed. You know, if you look at his position on gay rights back in 2010, when the government was attempting to pass a law legalising same-sex marriage, you know, he wrote a letter saying that it was the devil's envy and that the bill was a war against God. And then 3 years later, in 2013, he famously was asked by a journalist about gay priests, and he replied, "Who am I to judge?" So it sort of felt as if as soon as he actually became Pope, he began to kind of gradually shift the way that he was talking about these issues, but without ever actually making any proper changes. One thing that he did do that a lot of people said was huge for the LGBT community, Catholic LGBT community, was that he, back in 2023, he authorised the blessings of same-sex couples. So that was seen as a huge step. But effectively, he was kind of a populist pope who was trying to broaden his appeal to as many people as possible.
But then maybe in that sense, Chandrika, it doesn't sort of matter what country you come from. I mean, we're talking about how he was viewed in Argentina because he was Argentinian. But actually, this is the thing, isn't it? You become Pope and then you try your best to embody the values of being God's representative on earth. So actually, like, his personal views about gay marriage and abortion actually rightly take a back seat as he tries to approach this from the perspective of what would Jesus do? You know, I've chosen St. Francis to be the person I'm naming myself after. Maybe in that sense, when you become Pope, where you've come from is less important than it might be.
That's an interesting question, isn't it? Because the list of potential popes is more diverse than ever in terms of different countries. And if you look at it as essentially a political institution, which I think we kind of are, having that representation from different countries can be meaningful in a time when the world is probably becoming more secular than ever. And the papacy has to think about its image, about how it leads believers, about staying in step with the times. Why would you want to put off a large group of believers? So it is mysterious how they make the decisions, and I don't have any insight, but it does strike me that you have to keep up with a changing world or you become completely irrelevant, and that is something that is very dangerous for the papacy. That could happen very, very easily. And then you have this pope like Pope Francis, and certainly in Western media he was seen as a breath of fresh air. There were inconsistencies in what he said, but he felt like someone who stood up for the kind of rights that we'd stand up for, and in that sense it didn't necessarily convert anyone in this recording, but you did think better of him and therefore better of the institution, because they have. It's
definitely the Pope I related to the most in my lifetime 100%. As a non-Catholic. Like out of the three, he's the one that, you know, it
matters.
Yeah.
So it's a great public relations coup, because then when he dies, that is gigantic news and lots of different people's views are being asked for. And we've got an amazing angle here thanks to Harriet, and we are talking about it even though we sort of avoid the straightforward angle on this very big news story. So I think he has actually reached people who aren't necessarily going to become Catholics, but we are talking about him and the effect he has, and that in itself is a PR coup for the papacy. Well done.
Yeah, I mean, actually as well, Harriet, you know, because of the people that he's elevated to the conclave during his life as Pope, coming from countries, as Chandrika is alluding to there, that perhaps they didn't used to, you know, African countries, the Philippines, etc. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, that in itself might have been seen to be a progressive, inclusive action, but actually the next pope could end up being more conservative for that reason, because, there are Catholics in Africa who think things as mainstream doctrine that here even conservatives would blush at.
Yeah, I think we need to be really careful not to confuse progressive with populist. Like, just because you're trying to broaden the appeal of the church based on, like, PR, because although, yes, he gave priests the power to bless same-sex couples on certain circumstances, the Catholic Church still does not officially recognize same-sex marriages. The Pope himself used a highly offensive gay slur last year, an Italian word. So, wanting to project an impression of increasing tolerance to broaden the appeal without reforming any laws. So firstly, yeah, populism and progressive, not the same thing. It's also, it's incredibly obvious. The world might be becoming more secular, but the number of Catholics is increasing, primarily in Latin America. Almost 40% of the world's Catholics are in Latin America. The second biggest is the Philippines. It makes total sense if you would increase the presence of the Catholic Church and increase the representation in the Catholic Church from Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines, which is the 3 top countries for Catholic populations. So that just makes sense. But in terms of what we were talking about with his influence on national politics, he did think that the head of the Catholic Church should be able to influence national politics. That and the elected politicians of those countries. That idea is very prevalent in Latin America. A lot of people do agree with him on that. A lot of people also agree in the Philippines. So yes, he had the appearance of a more liberal pope, but actually, even after he became pope, he massively held up abortion legislation in Argentina. As just one example, it was seen to be his fault that was held up for so long. So the pope also has diplomatic relations with nearly 200 countries. That is access that's completely unparalleled.
Well, we saw that, didn't we, even in his final day meeting J.D. Vance?
I mean, even last year, he openly criticised Milei for the government using pepper spray on protesters in Argentina. The Pope has an enormous influence. A Pope from an African country, the Philippines, or a Latin American country, or perhaps the US. There's also the possibility that there might be a US Pope. What would it mean if the next Pope, like Pope Francis, believes that they should have a big influence in national politics in countries where there is a large Catholic population? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't think it's a far stretch to imagine that a Pope from, let's say, Italy, or an American Pope, 2 countries that have an enormously powerful position in terms of like the Christian right or evangelical Christianism or Catholicism, incredibly powerful. I don't think it's a far stretch to say that Pope Francis' legacy, it might not be so much of a populist or a Peronist or a progressive Pope, but as a Pope who interfered and who had an enormous influence on the politics of elected officials, the politics of countries that they come from.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, isn't it, Irene, if we do end up with an American Pope next? What is President Trump going to do with that? Because, if he carries on with the kind of political interference of Francis, Trump's going to call him a loser. He's going to say he's going to fire him.
Oh, God, yeah, I hadn't even considered what would happen if we had an American Pope.
I think it would be incredibly interesting to watch how the MAGA apparatus and the Trump administration, which is so deeply intertwined with the kind of white Christian evangelicalism and the power of Catholicism in the US as well. I was so surprised when I read that the 4th biggest country in the world for Catholic population was the US. It goes Brazil, Mexico, Philippines, the US. And we've already seen Trump with like his hand on Bibles. We've already seen that politics in the US, particularly politics of Trump and the far right and MAGA, has weaponized Christianity and religious symbolism. And, what would the implications be with an American Pope? Who would weaponize who would come out on top, the Pope or Trump? But I think whichever way it would go, it seems likely to me that it would be incredibly powerful relationship. It'd be really, yeah.
It would be entertaining. Okay, up next, why being a bachelor might be good for your brain. That's after this. Okay, so Chandrika, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is marriage good for your health?
But before I talk about the stages, I always like to make the note. Stages can be misleading because a lot of times families will take it as, oh, maybe that means my mom's going to be like this for a little while, and then, oh, she'll switch to this, and then she'll be in this for a certain period of time, and then, oh, it'll tell us. And it doesn't really go like that. Everyone's journey with dementia is different. For example, my grandma, she was in stage 5 or 6 for years and years, but she was only in stage 7 for a week. So it really depends on the person and the journeys.
Joanna, a dementia expert on TikTok, talking about some of the stages of Alzheimer's there. So Chandrika, what's that got to do with marriage?
Yeah, so we traditionally think that marriage is quite good for your health, particularly a heterosexual marriage is good for male health. But there's been a shock new study that says that marriage is linked to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So that's pretty surprising, right? I thought the opposite.
And where does this study come from?
The study comes from America, from Florida, and basically staying single or divorcing could lower your odds of getting dementia, according to researchers at Florida State University.
And how long have they been carrying out this study? How was the study conducted?
It's from Florida State University, and they carried it out by tracking more than 24,000 Americans without dementia at the start of the study. They were tracked for up to 18 years, and the team compared rates across all kinds of marital groups. So more marital groups than before. It was quite binary before, married or unmarried. They looked at married, divorced, widowed, and never married. And so this kind of changed what they got. And these were quite surprising results, because usually it's the idea that being married is good for your health. There's also possibly a bias where married people notice the beginnings of dementia in each other, and so they report it at high levels. But yeah, this is kind of something new and possibly good news for people who are not in a marriage.
Possibly. I mean, Irene, it could just be, couldn't it, that there's no connection at all between whether you're married and single and whether you get dementia, because it's in your brain. I mean, why are people spending 18 years studying this? Why do they think there's a link?
I mean, I think people are really fascinated by this topic. And there's been so many studies about whether or not marriage is good for you. You know, a lot of research has found that you're more likely to survive a heart attack if you're married, you're more likely to survive diabetes. And people think largely that it's because you've got a nagging spouse who's basically...
Yeah, I didn't want to drift into cliche, but absolutely in my case, that is right.
But,
I go to the doctor because my wife insists I go to the doctor. That is why.
Well, exactly. And they'll encourage you to have a healthier lifestyle. They'll encourage you to take your medication. And so, you know, that's likely to kind of can have some huge benefits. But then other studies have found that actually, you know, you've got to look at things as well, like divorce or the death of a spouse can actually have a huge negative impact on your health. So, and quite an interesting study that I saw found that people who had never married actually lived longer than those who had gone through a marital breakup. And I think the most important thing to remember is it's not just, you know, having the marriage certificate. It's about how the overall happiness of the marriage. So other studies have actually found that having a stressful marriage with lots of conflict can actually increase your risk of heart attacks and having a stroke. And I saw something quite recently as well the other week about a study that found for men that get married, it triples their risk of obesity. So it's a mixed bag, basically.
Again, I'm not going to add a personal comment to that one, except to say that I'm now wearing a XXL shirt. I mean, I suppose, Harriet, again, it sort of seems like you can find whatever answer you want looking at all sorts of different studies. Why is it important with relation to dementia in particular to find that? I'm just thinking, you know, Florida State University, that's a respected institution. Someone spent 18 years examining whether there's a link between marriage and dementia. Why?
You say that like it's not one of the world's biggest killers, and also one of the world's biggest drains on like the social care system and on health systems more broadly, and one of the most devastating illnesses that can impact families, communities, everything.
True, but it's not a cure, is it? Get married or to get divorced.
I think it's just trying to build up a picture of all the different factors that could influence the risk of you getting dementia. So we were talking briefly about this new study, but the big study in 2019 that Chandrika mentioned found actually that all unmarried people had significantly higher odds of developing dementia than married people. Now, you would assume that that was to do with money and health, and that only accounted for part of that variation. So that's really
So
interesting.
you'd assume it was to do with money because if you're married, there's more money in the household.
Exactly. That actually remaining single, unpartnered, living alone is a huge financial hit. It's a financial hit, and that only increases as you age. But I think the thing is that we generalize way too much here, because A, the picture is completely different for men and women, both in terms of dementia risk and in terms of more broadly in terms of health, happiness, mental health. The picture is completely different for divorce, marriage, widowhood, separation, everything across genders. Like, generally speaking, being married is better for men than for women, and generally speaking, getting divorced is worse for men's health than it's better for women's mental health. But the big correlation is with finances, which is really interesting, because that's what increased wealth is linked to a reduced risk of dementia. But that is more than just because increased wealth means better education, so better cognition and better physical health. There's more at play than that, and that's what they're trying to figure out with these studies, is what exactly are all these different factors that are all contributing to a picture of risk. Because there's also the kids element. Like, having two or more children has been linked to a decreased risk of dementia, which obviously coupled people are far more likely to do. But also having children means that you have more of a chance of being financially hit, which would then impact your risk. But then also you have kids that could like help look after you and support you in your dementia. So well, I guess what I'm saying is it's a very complicated picture, but the biggest variation, and this is why we have to be careful talking about married or unmarried, is that the biggest variation in all the studies is between people who live alone and people who live with a partner. So it's not necessarily a question of married or unmarried,
Support.
as it is a question of cohabitated partner.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Is that your take as well, Sachandrika, looking at this study? As your, this is your story of the week. What is it about it that intrigues you?
Just the sharp turn from the 2019 study saying that all unmarried groups are at a much higher risk, and then not many years later, a study that must have been going on at the same time because it was 18 years long, saying actually the opposite. And I think it's more about what we're talking about when we say the words married, unmarried, widowed, divorced, and so on. As Harriet has kind of mentioned, it's about the relationships themselves and about someone who knows your habits intimately well. So that is usually a partner rather than, say, a housemate, a child as well, knowing that you were able to remember where you left your keys every night a year ago, but you don't now. So finding those really early symptoms is probably somebody who, let's be honest, loves you and knows you that well.
I think what's quite interesting as well that while I think they did say in that article, if I've got this right, that it wasn't even just there were quite a few issues with the study. So before we kind of read too much into it, yes, the data could have been skewed because people were getting diagnosed earlier because they've got that person there, but actually the participants were having annual visits with their doctor, so they should have been able to really spot the signs. I think they were also saying that you need to think about the sample itself. It wasn't a very representative sample of the wider population, and there were quite low levels of ethnic and income diversity, and also 64% of the participants that were involved in the study were married. So I think all of those things, it might not be that might have also impacted the data.
But also I don't see the hope here. Sometimes you get a study about dementia and we're able to say on the show, this is great for this thing that affects so many people. We'll now know what to look out for. We'll now know how to train our brains. We'll now know what vegetables not to eat. No one's going to make a decision about whether they get married or not based on whether they might get dementia. Like, what does this actually mean for people whose families are affected by this horrible disease?
I think it really highlights the danger of loneliness. Honestly, I think that's like a really big takeaway from, and we've thrown a lot of different studies out here, a lot of different risk factors. We've talked about dementia risk, we've talked about heart disease risk, weight, depression, anxiety, all these different issues that are basically exacerbated or mitigated by marriage or being coupled or partnered. But a big takeaway from all of them is just how dangerous it is for your health, mental health, and your financial health to live alone. Like, that's a big takeaway. And for me, speaking as a single woman who lives alone, that's not exactly like it's not a particularly encouraging takeaway. But having looked at all of these studies and analyzed all these different risk factors, I have kind of taken to understand that my best bet would be to get married, rinse the guy for all the financial security that would entail, either divorce him and get really well deal in a good divorce court, or be widowed and get a good life insurance payout, then pay for someone to live with me, because ultimately your big risk factor is probably like, I could just fall off a chair in my flat, break my leg on the floor and like rot here. No one would know.
We'd know,
no one would. I would
know when you
be
didn't show
dead.
up for the
I
weekend
would
wrap.
be dead by the time that happened. The cat would have eaten me.
Okay. Up next, oh my God, there's a must-taste chocolate, you guys. That's after this. Irene, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why has everyone gone nuts for pistachios?
3, 2, 1.
Oh.
It doesn't smell like anything, though.
Who smells their food? Oh.
Here, you want to try that one? That's
In
what
3,
it looks like.
2.
Right?
Actually,
Okay.
I didn't think it was going to be crunchy, the green thing. I thought it was going to be like some gooey stuff, but it's really good.
I'm obsessed.
YouTubers The Shoffs on Wednesday tasting something. Irene, what were they putting in their mouths?
It's this craze that there's been for Dubai chocolate, which is essentially this really chunky chocolate bar that's filled with pistachio paste, tahini, and this crispy shredded filo
Now you're talking
pastry.
my language.
And it was a husband and wife. They made this bar when this woman had pregnancy cravings. She was living in Dubai and she wanted to create a chocolate bar that was similar to this dessert that her mum made when she was a child. So she had this modest business, and then in 2023 a food influencer tried the bar and suddenly it went completely viral. Everybody wanted to try it, but it was only available in Dubai. So since then, you've probably seen in the shops, all of the supermarkets have been creating their own dupes, and they've been popping up everywhere. And there's been a sort
Of this chocolate, so what am I supposed to have seen in the shops? A thick chocolate bar filled with pistachio.
You'll see it. It's kind of, just pistachio filled chocolate, basically.
Can
really
I just
chunky
survey
bar.
that quickly? Harriet Sachandrika, have you seen such a thing in the shops? Have you seen the duplicate products?
I actually did, but only because Irene wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago ranking all the best dupes, and I started seeing them everywhere. And I had never noticed. I'd noticed pistachio everywhere for the last year or two, but I had never noticed anything whatsoever to do with Dubai chocolate. I just exist in a completely different algorithmic space. But yeah, Irene wrote this piece a couple of weeks ago, and since then I have not stopped seeing them. It's everywhere.
Can't stop seeing it. Interesting. So I haven't seen it, although as Harriet says, I've seen the pistachio trend. I did pick up a tub of Marks & Spencer's pistachio ice cream a couple of weeks ago because I thought it sounded novel. But just to represent the full spread, producer Sophie this week, she said that she saw a Dubai chocolate bar imitation in her local petrol station shop. So they are around. Irene, continue.
This is the thing, it's everywhere. And I think the distinguishing factor is that it's not just the pistachio, it's the crunchy bits of pastry in there and this thick kind of gooey filling. And so all of the major chocolate brands have come out with their own versions. Waitrose even had to implement a 2 bar per person limit on the bars because there was this kind of hysteria of people trying to buy them. And it's quite expensive. They're typically priced between about £10 and £20 for a bar of this chocolate. So it's very
utterly
expensive.
ridiculous.
Yeah,
What?
It's really expensive, but that comes on to part of the reason that it's so expensive and why I chose the story this week is that this craze for Dubai chocolate has triggered an international pistachio shortage. So the prices of the pistachio kernels have soared, and the news article that's kind of hit the headlines this week is Giles Hacking of the nut trader CG Hacking told the Financial Times that pistachio kernel prices have surged from $7.65 a pound a year ago to around $10.30 a pound, and that there's been a global shortage caused by this trend.
Well, that's all right if you're sticking in a 20 quid chocolate bar, isn't it? I guess the problem is for all the people that just used to like to snack on pistachios.
Yeah, it's basically there's been this huge international shortage and it's come on the back of pistachio was already named Nut of the Year by a lot of food industry experts in 2023. So
I missed my invite to that award ceremony, sadly.
there was already this trend for everything pistachio. And a lot of it is because it just looks the bright green colour. People just love it. And they love posting all over Instagram and TikTok clips of them kind of trying pistachio flavoured things.
And Harriet, pistachios come from the US, but also Iran. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? It's not a country that you think we must buy their produce.
God, yeah, it's so interesting. This is I got so into this. Pistachios are like the perfect example of kind of 30, 40 years worth of trade war between the US and Iran. So this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, by the way. So just to be clear before we start talking about where they come.
It's not we're
Harriet, talking
of course it is.
Billions of dollars, and the price has been going up for the past 20 years. So the nut is actually native to Iran, and the pistachio trade goes back thousands and thousands of years. But together now, the US and Iran control, I think, something like between 70 and 80% of the world's pistachio output. But pistachio farming in the US is relatively new. Like, it only started in the 30s with seeds from Iran. And the US has basically been in a pistachio trade war with Iran ever since. And in the 70s, US people were eating like 20 million pounds of Iranian pistachios a year. They were dyed red, actually. This is really like a fun historical fact. They used to be dyed red.
Why?
I'm not really sure why. I think they just looked nice. Anyway, people used to know...
Not because it's the cover of the Iranian Revolution.
I couldn't comment. But people would have these rosy fingers if they had been eating pistachios in the 70s in the US. But after the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979, the US severed ties with Iran and sanctioned it to high heaven. And there was a full trade embargo, including on pistachios. And then about just less than 10 years later, they had kind of eased the sanctions and pistachios became exempt. But the US, there was all this drama with like tariffs and restrictions, and Iran still had big trouble accessing international financial markets. And also the US put these enormous tariffs on Iranian pistachios, so basically cut off the US market. And they used that time to expand their own market, especially in California, and start exporting to China. So most of the US pistachios go to China, while most of the Iranian pistachios go to Europe and the UAE, and Dubai, for example. And in 2008, the US surpassed Iran to become the world's top pistachio exporter. But then this big drought in 2014 kind of halved their crop. So that was a big opportunity for Iran, and they undercut the market. But still, it's just so interesting because Iranian pistachios are exempt from sanctions. So they're really an amazing kind of lifeline for the regime. But obviously the US doesn't really like that. And then we've got, we can talk about a bit later kind of the future of that relationship, under Trump 2.0 with all the tariffs and further sanctions and more of a global trade war. But it's just fascinating. I think what people really need to take away from this is that this is worth billions and billions and billions of dollars. And it is really important to the US for Iran not to become the world's biggest exporter again.
Okay, I mean, that is really interesting. But on the other hand, to Chandrika, yes, pistachios have been with us, as Harriet suggests, for decades. But actually, this food trend thing that Irene's bringing us, the idea that there could be a surge, that's a blip, isn't it? Pistachios won't be the thing in 5 years' time. And yet this is happening increasingly. Food trends online, spiking and really distorting the market.
Yep, so you've got some other examples that are also green. You've got matcha, and that's become a kind of trend, and the demand for it has just gone through the roof. So it's gone from 1,471 tonnes in 2010 up to 4,176 tonnes in 2023. So it's really kind of quadrupled almost in that time, and matcha's very fashionable. So prices have surged as a result. There's the scarcity. Obviously, this is what always happens with these supply chains. The price goes up, you can't buy as much, people are clamouring for it, the trend is still ongoing. And all of this matcha comes from a small Japanese town of Uji that specialises in this production. So they are ill-equipped to meet that demand. And then what you get is kind of off-brand items, like not the real matcha, but like stuff that's kind of
Yes.
quickly cobbled together to meet the demand, right?
I mean, bougie food trends, Irene, and what they do to the world. I mean, quite aside from pistachios, that is the story here, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think, you know, these trends, you kind of buy something like a matcha latte or this pistachio chocolate, and you don't realise that these kind of viral trends that we're seeing on social media are having a very real, dangerous impact on the planet, you know. And the global supply chains they just can't cope with them. I think it's really interesting when you look at with pistachios in particular. There's been a huge reversal of where things stood just a couple of years ago in 2023, when the global pistachio supply exceeded demand. So there was actually a price drop. And at that point, there was a lot of spare pistachio butters and pastes and oils, which you could easily add to foods to bulk them out. And if you fast forward to now, already before the Dubai chocolate trend kind of kicked in, the pistachio stocks were already struggling because there'd been a really disappointing harvest last year in the US. And as well as there being a disappointing harvest, the crop was actually higher quality, which meant that there weren't as many cheap shell-free kernels available that could just be used to easily bulk them out. So, you know, there wasn't much already in terms of supply. Then you throw something in like this trend, and people are just scrambling to try and get their hands on the remaining kernels.
Because I think that's the thing that really comes through in this story is, yes, there's always been trends, and trends have always dictated demand, and demand has always dictated supply. But like Irene said, supply chains can't cope with the kind of overnight explosion of demand that something that goes viral ends up causing. Like, when something is viral, it's not compatible with sustainable. And you also can't separate a foodstuff or a product from where it's grown, where it's processed. You have to think about what kind of regimes these trends bolster, or the outcome of a massive increase in demand on the economy, the trade, and also the geopolitics. Like we were talking between Iran and the US. I mean, with 70% of US pistachios, more than half of them are going to China. Like, with a trade war with China, some of that market share will obviously go to Iran. And Iran also has a big advantage in terms of location, because it can get stuff to Europe and to Asia much quicker, much easier and cheaper than the US can. So you can't separate what you're eating from where it comes from and the impact on the environment too. These might be drought-resistant trees. Like, that's why California is investing so heavily in pistachios rather than almonds, because they're pretty good for drought, but they're still really water intensive. This is still supply chains are not set up for viral fame, and viral makes things unsustainable. You know, it's the damage that these kind of trends, these bougie trends that overnight can cause. People cannot separate what they eat with where it comes from.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it, Sachandrika? I understand everything that's just been said about the environmental consequences and all the rest of it. But, you know, I do now want to try one of these chocolate bars because I feel like I'm missing out because I haven't. And that's something about us as humans, isn't it? Particularly with food. You see this with sugar. It taps into and salt. It taps into our desires, you know, to propagate, to stay alive. And we get far too much of it and then we get fat. But, I mean, I can't help it. I've seen the picture. I want to try it. Social media has brought about an acceleration in all of those harmful things to us as people.
Ollie, can I introduce you to a slightly healthier trend that is very cool, very bougie, you look great on TikTok. It's slightly older, but it's called avocados.
Oh, I'm already on the avocado train.
Okay,
Don't worry
I'm
about
glad. Stay on the avocado trend. So in 2015, so it's pretty old.
Such a bad example.
Exactly, because it's done exactly the same thing. So 10 years ago, avocado became the go-to brunch food. If you're having eggs, you've got to have avocado. If you're not having avocado, what are you doing? And they were the most pinned thing on Pinterest. Their avocados, Meghan Markle, I believe, had some interaction with avocados that didn't go well for her. And now there's a global avocado shortage. Australians who invented the avocado, they didn't. But they invented brunch. They're paying $7 an avocado. There's a crime wave of mass thefts. And can you believe it? New Zealand? I thought it was just sheep there. But can I just say, it's not my favourite food shortage, but it's quite a fun one. KFC, when it ran out of chicken in 2018. People called the police.
Yes, that was problematic.
People called the police. There was one example I read of a woman called the police. I'm not pro food shortage. In fact, I'm very much the opposite. But if you have to have one, it's the KFC food shortage. In February 2018, it's a joy. There are memes. If you don't know about it, listener,
let's all get together and like buy the unpopular foods now. Let's buy the short. Do you know what I mean? Let's go and get mutton or
Yes.
something.
Now I just want to eat KFC.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for your contributions all, Sir Chandrika, Harriet and Irene. Finger licking good. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine. No shortage here with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye.